Hello, and welcome to my presentation on Sigmund Freud and psychoanalysis. My name is Bryan Adams. I am a clinical psychology student in the Department of Behavioral Sciences at California Southern University. The class is Psych 8503, History and Systems of Psychology. My professor is Dr. Stacy Benton, and today's date is January 18th, 2024. Sigmund Freud was born Sigismund Shlomo Freud in 1856 in an area that is now known as the Czech Republic. He was born to Jewish parents, and a fun fact for later in his life, much later, is that while living in Austria, he would end up having to flee Nazi persecution. At around 4 years old, him and his family picked up and they moved to Austria. And as a child, it was noted that he showed exceptional interest and potential in medicine and language. He had several brothers and sisters, but as adults, they would end up going off their separate ways to all different parts of the world. A lot of secondary sources state that Sigmund regarded himself as his mother Amelia's favorite child, which may have influenced some of his developments in theory later on, which we'll get into in the following slides. He also similarly would write that he felt a complex and competitive relationship characterized by ambivalence towards his father Jacob Freud, which as well may have influenced some of his later theoretical work. Around the age of 17 in the year 1873, Freud began attending college at the University of Vienna. He originally started college with the intention of becoming a lawyer, but after some consultations with advisors and mentors, he decided to study medicine with a particular interest in neurology. Around this time in the late 19th century, big advancements were being made in scientific study, and it's noted that Freud wanted to be a part of that as well, also influencing his decision to study medicine and neurology. 8 years after he started college, he would graduate with a medical's doctor's degree, and then he went on to do his postdoctoral work in neurology at Vienna General Hospital. Several years later, he would receive a scholarship to study under Jean-Martin Charcot, a famous French neurologist who specialized in hypnosis and hysteria. Hysteria is of special importance as Sigmund also did his own case studies on hysteria and was interested in the pathology of it, particularly in women. Jean Martin's specialization in hypnosis and hysteria had this kind of mysticism and unknown regarding the human mind. And that would impact a lot of Freud's later work, particularly on the unconscious and mental processes that were inaccessible in conscious states. This is a graphic showing Sigmund Freud's publications and significant professional works, starting with his birth all the way to his death. And then on the right is a timeline of works that either corresponded with his works or were extensions of his works, like, for example, Carl Jung and Alfred Adler, and kind of the neo-Freudian works in psychodynamic theories as well. And so you can see in 1895, he's focusing on hysteria, and it's not until 5 years later, after studying under Jean Martin, that he would publish The Interpretation of Dreams, which is probably one of the most significant historical publishings in the field of psychology. So family issues on psychoanalysis development. Freud's mother and father and the issues he may have had with them certainly influenced his later theoretical work from his childhood. A lot of his life pre-University of Vienna is kind of shrouded in a bit of mystery. There's not a lot of primary sources, so we have to rely on secondary and tertiary sources. But what we do know is that Freud characterized his relationship with his father Jacob as ambivalent, and he always felt this need to be in competition with him over the attention of his mother. And then conversely, the relationship with his mother, he regarded himself as his mother's favorite. She would often refer to him as Golden Siggy or similar variations of that, kind of signifying favorite child. Freud was also his mother Amelia's oldest son, and he was born with a caul on his head, which would believe they're referring to the umbilical cord or something in the birth. He was born with on his head, and in that culture symbolized good fortune, and that may have impacted how she interacted with him, later impacting how he understood the parent-child relationship with with a parent of the opposite sex. And this relationship really becomes amplified by the kind of opposite relationship, which was a little bit strained with his father. And so moving on to other family issues I thought were worth noting after the development of psychoanalysis was regarding Freud's daughter. Anna was his eldest daughter, and she followed in her father's footsteps and did a lot of work in psychoanalysis and on childhood psychosocial development. She expanded on a lot of his theoretical works in defense mechanisms and kind of revamped a lot of how child psychosocial development was kind of conceptualized in the neo-Freudian and psychodynamic paradigms. And she was part of this whole kind of renaissance in the field post-psychoanalysis, which eventually, branched off to other schools of thought and a lot of exponential developments in the field. So now let's get into an overview of psychoanalysis. On the right, we have a graphic which is the iceberg model, and that's how Sigmund tended to conceptualize his theory of mind. So we see on the top of the iceberg consciousness and ideas, and thoughts that we are aware of. And the second level below that is pre-consciousness, material that can be easily recalled. And then moving on to the ego. The ego is kind of this psychic structure within the mind governed by the reality principle, which refers to our ability to understand the external world. Lower on the iceberg, we can see the superego. Below the surface of the water, we have the unconscious. And then we have the id, which is another psychic structure governed by the pleasure principle, referring to our instinctual need to satisfy basic desires. And then when we move on to mental processes within his model, particularly defense mechanisms like repression, projection, denial, all of which kind of manifest to protect the internal self from psychic harm, either from the external world or from a conflict between the psychic structures of the ego and the superego. And then dreams have a special place in psychoanalytic theory. They're seen as messages from the unconscious that can be analyzed and contain repressed memories and messages. Continuing on with the second part of psychoanalytic theory, we have our psychosexual stages. And just to give a very brief overview, Freud believed that children go through a stage where they have a fixation on a particular body part because of the sensory experience they associate it with. And so through the theory, we have 0 to 1, the oral stage, referring to bottle feeding and teething and breastfeeding, and 1 to 3, the anal stage, referring to kind of becoming aware of toilet training and bodily processes. And then on to the phallic stage, into puberty, latency stage, and then into adulthood. And so we can see a lot of the theory revolves around the early years and around sensory development. He also had the Oedipus and the Electra components of his theory. Oedipus being for boys and Electra being for girls, which is essentially a psychosexual competition with a same-sex parent. So, for example, a boy against a father for the mother, or the inverse. And that's another component that's received a lot of criticism because in this theory, Freud speculates that it's part of natural development for a child to develop a sexual attraction or romantic interest in their opposite sex parent. Moving along to psychoanalytic therapy, this uses techniques informed by his theory of mind. From the previous slide, techniques include free association, which includes open speaking to reveal unconscious processes, dream interpretation, transference and counter-transference, referring to projections between the therapist and the client inversely. Oh, and also the role of the therapist in assisting the patient to interpret their unconscious. So, some of the cultural perspectives associated with Freud's theory include European colonialism. There was a lot of globalist expansion going on, and leading to Europe kind of viewing themselves as superior to societies that they were incorporating. And then a lot of Freud's earlier work was shaped by religious and mythological ideologies, kind of evidenced by the Oedipus complex, referring to a Greek mythological character. And then naturalism, which was a school of thought focused on observable behavior and biology, kind of reflected in his incorporation of neurons into his theory. Some biases associated with psychoanalysis, gender bias. He used to pathologize women quite heavily in a lot of his works, particularly on hysteria, and this led to disparities in understanding in the field. And also the relationship with his mother and father, which may have been shaped by their cultural roots and may have influenced his bias on how he understood family dynamics. And then also patriarchal views in the late 19th century and early 20th century. This was before women's rights, and women were seen as inferior to men by a lot of people. And then the impact of psychoanalysis on contemporary mental health helped establish psychotherapy as an intervention, and then establish concepts like the unconscious and defense mechanisms that are still considered valid today, and then inspiring the work of the Neo-Freudians and other schools of thought in the coming years. A lot of the ethical issues surrounding psychoanalysis are the same as when it was created. One of the big ones is lack of falsifiability. The subjectivity required in the process kind of makes it near impossible to replicate, which raises concerns when you're incorporating it into practice with individuals. And then there's of course the the influence of how it was created, the time period, the gender bias, etc. Another ethical issue is the length of time. It can extend quite long, and so that creates an issue when it comes to money from the client for direct pay or from the insurance company, and keeping people in therapy for long periods of time. And then one unique one is false memories. So the exploration of the unconscious has been linked to creating false memories in people, which can kind of create a weird turn in therapy and kind of misdirect the purpose of it, which is an ethical issue to be aware of. One thing I forgot to mention on the previous slide was confidentiality. Psychoanalysis can explore some deeply personal concepts which the therapist may have to report, which can create an ethical dilemma in clinical practice. And so my personal reflection on psychoanalysis, so his theory and work, they apply to my career goals and practice, particularly on the notion of the impact of childhood events and the unconscious, and the understanding of defense mechanisms, an understanding of psychoanalysis as a base theory that many contemporary theories have grown from. And I believe that studying it can help you understand the roots of where other schools, Gestalt or behaviorism or humanistic psychology came from, and kind of give you a more complete understanding. For practice, having awareness and avoiding current and past ethical issues associated with it, particularly around gender bias, cultural influences, and the length of time a patient may have to stay in therapy, and false memories, and just knowing how to having an awareness of them and knowing that those can be an issue from using it wrong. And ways that you can sort of mitigate that include ongoing training or reflective supervision with a supervisor or consultation with a trusted peer. And so I relate clinical practice to like having a tool bag, knowing which tools to use and when to expand your abilities as a therapist and psychologist, right? And yeah, that kind of concludes my presentation. I'm running out of time here, so I hope you've enjoyed it, and I'll just scroll through the references here. So thank you for your time.